So my name is Bethany Hills, and I'm an attorney. And we seem to be doing like little bits of sharing about our aha moments in our life. So my aha moment was when I decided as an undergraduate I didn't want to be a scientist. Sorry. I was a chemistry major at the Philadelphia College of Science and Technology, and I was doing applied chemistry in textiles and sort of industrial areas. I thought, this is really, really crappy being stuck in a lab, and I don't like that. And so I went on to be a lawyer and get my master's in public health, and I focus on biostatistics, and I am a lawyer in the healthcare space. I represent drug and device companies, and we do all sorts of really cool, exciting things. And I'm going to talk to you about some of the opportunities for rare disease development. And then hopefully you'll actually talk about rare diseases at this symposium, and not just the background. So I have very few slides because I have very little time, and I have a lot of information to share with you. So hopefully if you have questions about this, I've given entire full-hour presentations just on the orphan drug designation and just on the rare pediatric disease voucher. So please do contact me if you have questions about how these work. So the orphan drug designation was part of a statutory change, so that means the actual law, Congress, which we sometimes like Congress and sometimes don't. This was a good move by Congress. They actually put in place the Orphan Drug Act, which created an opportunity for a number of incentives. And there are incentives built into the orphan drug program on the back end that I'm going to talk about. But let's first talk about the first step in the process is you actually have to be designated as an orphan disease. And I think we all understand, presumably everyone in the room understands why we call these orphan diseases. And the idea is because they wouldn't have parents, they don't have a sponsor. There's really very little market or commercial incentive to do drug development in this space. The main reason is because the population is so small. This is a small population defined at less than 200,000 people. Now, what I actually do in practice is try and find ways to work with our clients to somehow define, and I roll my eyes because many of these diseases are like subcategories of diseases, very tiny morphology of a disease, trying to look at subsets of populations and get them to fit into that category of 200,000, because the incentives for orphan drug designation and what can happen on the back end are actually so great that people slice and dice and try and fit themselves into an orphan designation as much as possible, which may not be what the original intent was, of course, of Congress. I think we're looking at true rare diseases, but it's a good thing to know when you're talking about maybe having a group and a hub focused on rare diseases. Is there are opportunities and regulatory opportunities to get some of these incentives that could then fund and fuel further research into other areas. So what are these mysterious incentives that I'm telling you about? So first of all, exclusivity. So this is important. This means that no one else can do what you do in this disease with this drug for 7 years. There's a 7-year exclusivity. It's called a marketing exclusivity. It does not add to your patent. So what I do a lot is work with our intellectual property attorneys and our clients on their patent portfolio and how they've protected their intellectual property. And a patent may run for an X number of years. We do lots of drug development in the interim, and then you might get your FDA approval at point X in time, but your patent may only last for 2 more years. So you have a risk in the market that someone's going to, they won't infringe on your patent for those 2 years, but quite soon afterwards they might. And so this marketing exclusivity is not an extension of your patent. Your patent will still expire, but you will not be able to have any competitor approved by FDA. So FDA becomes the gatekeeper and will not review. They'll accept applications for comparable diseases and comparable drugs, but they literally go in the file. And they will start when the exclusivity runs on that first day. Then they can start reviewing any of those backed up applications. So it literally is a market exclusivity. It's not a change to the length of your patent. And those are extremely useful when we talk about having a product on the market and not having to worry about competitors. You're the only game in town, and so that's really an important piece. A couple other small incentives, but actually turn out to be quite big incentives, and I know Michael, who's now escaped the, oh, there he is in the back. He's like, oh, legal talk, I'm out of here. He made some comment, a generous comment about local government officials and some of the problems that we can have when we talk about old schemes. And unfortunately, there is a taxing scheme in the United States and actually throughout the world. And folks are required to pay taxes when they make money, whether you're a corporation or an individual. And so there's actually quite a lucrative tax credit associated with orphan drug development. And when you have that period of exclusivity and you're actually making money on the market, you actually have a pretty decent tax credit, which will allow you to avoid paying taxes. You actually get to keep more of your money during that time period, which is also a pretty big incentive. Not only is that's under the federal tax code, states like New York actually have piggybacked that and have other additional tax incentives if you have those types of designations. So I think that's one area of opportunity to think about when you're trying to think about building a hub in a particular area. Really trying to work and make sure companies understand the full range of incentives. The last thing is, does anyone in the room know how much it costs to file a new drug application with FDA? Not my fees are high too, but the fee to the FDA. Anyone?
A lot of money.
A lot of money. Right now it's about $2.5 million, the fee. A small business can get, it's about a third of that. It's less than $1 million, about 700,000, something like that. They change every year. There's a fee schedule. And the reason for those fees, FDA otherwise would just do things at their sweet old time. So the fees are there to hire new people and incentivize. There's a time schedule. It's negotiated with industry. It's called the PDUFA, the Pharmaceutical Drug and Manufacturing Act, which is a user fee act. And there's a GDUFA, which is for generics, and a MDUFA for medical devices. And so with the user fee for orphan drugs is very, very, very reduced. It's a tenth, an eighth. It's less than $500,000. It's a significant savings. So for a company that probably is working very hard to get to the point where they can get some of these incentives, the ability to have a reduced fee. So it's very important to get this designation. Once you have the designation, then you have an opportunity to work with FDA through a variety of other, so really all it is like a certificate you can hang on your wall. People get the orphan drug designation fairly early in the process. And then the best part about it is once you get that, you, if you happen to be a public company, or if you're going to raise money, you go out into the marketplace and you say, we're an orphan drug and we've been designated by the FDA, and somehow people throw money at that. And I'm not making this up. There are many economic analyses around this. Announcing your orphan drug designation is a major financial driver for fundraising events in your company. So as you can imagine, we spend quite a bit of time up against totally fake deadlines, but these are deadlines that are important to make sure that our clients have the funding that they need to go forward. I'm going to speak now about the rare pediatric disease. I keep looking like I'm changing slides. I put everything on one slide, so we don't have to change slides. The Rare Pediatric Disease Voucher program is probably one of my favorites. I am working with a very well-known academic institution right now to establish a rare disease hub at their academic institution. So we've been talking to the Westchester Biotech Project about they have some outposts here in Westchester, and we'll continue to have that discussion. There's not a lot of money to develop rare disease drugs, and there's also not a lot of patients. So we're going to talk about that, and I think the next speaker is going to talk about some of the clinical study challenges, and I'm going to give you a couple hints on how to work with the FDA through that. So what is the Rare Disease Voucher? This is the program that FDA hates. They hate this program. They have tried to get it removed through congressional activity at every possible turn. The 21st Century Cures Act was a massive 2,000-page bipartisan legislation that was not confrontational at all. It was signed in December of 2016, right at the departure of the Obama administration, with little fanfare outside of, the geeks like me who read all this stuff, which is a ton of new changes. And in that process, everything the FDA asked for, everything Congress asked for, everyone was very, kumbaya, and there's lots of new money, there's lots of new programs. I'm going to mention a couple. FDA still tried to get the rare disease voucher program removed from the books, even in that process. They hate it. What is it? You first must get your product candidate designated to be a treatment for a rare pediatric disease. So you have to make sure you're working from a list of what is considered a rare pediatric disease. There are a good number of them that have already been identified. FDA has a list. Once you develop your drug for that rare pediatric disease, you have to go through the whole development process. You have to submit to FDA, you have to get approval. But when you get approval, FDA gives you what I call the Willy Wonka golden ticket. It is literally a voucher that you can then use to have priority review on any drug submission in the future. And this has an extraordinary market value. The most expensive one so far has sold on the open market for almost $400 million. That seems to be the cap because we are seeing them come back down. There were two earlier this year that were sold. One was for $150 million and one was for $170-something million. Obviously, they're worth whatever the company buying them. It's like real estate. The real value is what the purchaser thinks it's worth. And so there was a point in time when a company, a big drug company, so these can be sold on the open market, thought that paying $350, almost $400 million for this Willy Wonka golden ticket the priority review guarantees FDA will review your drug application in 6 months. So a normal review cycle is 9 months. The reality is it's usually like a year or a year and a half. And so by those extra 6 months of having that drug on the market, that company thought that it was cheaper to buy the voucher and be able to turn the voucher in and guarantee a 6-month review than to have their review process take an extra 6 months. That is for not an orphan, I'm sure that is not an orphan drug product. That is some sort of product that is a diabetes or a cardiovascular indication that will have many, many, many patients, and getting on the market even 2 days faster is a very big economic driver. FDA doesn't like these because what it does is it requires that whoever comes in with that voucher gets to jump ahead of everybody else. They get to everything has to be cleared off the desk. It doesn't matter what FDA is working on. And FDA is filled with scientists and regulatory geeks, and they're usually very invested in the review of what they're looking at, and they're kind of in the middle of something. And if one of these comes in, it is very disruptive to the agencies. So that's why they try and get rid of this program. Although I've heard nothing about complaints or challenges. In fact, a couple plugs for Scott Gottlieb. He has cleaned up. There was an orphan drug designation backlog of almost, I think it was a couple hundred applications that were well over the 90-day review period. They've all been cleaned up in the last year. They are on time, they are on schedule. You ask for your orphan drug designation and you get your response in the 90 days. So I do see a good commitment from FDA to really work with access in these programs. Does anyone have any questions on those? Yeah.
I had a question on the voucher program.
Everyone always does.
What was the original intent by the FDA? It would appear that it was possibly to reward the company who got the designation. And why not just make them non-transferable?
It was not the FDA's idea. It was Congress's idea. And it is exactly for the market driver. Rare pediatric diseases are even more rare than regular rare diseases, and they are much harder to do studies in. They're very complicated to get approvals. There is a view that without this type of an incentive, these companies, so yes, the company that bought the voucher gets to get their drug through, whatever it is, I don't know, some new cardiovascular drug that we don't need or some new Viagra that we don't need. That goes through the market, through faster, but that orphan drug company now has $350 million in their pocket. And the idea is you're supposed to incentivize that company to then continue to do development. So even if you might only have developed that drug for a narrow indication in a small population, you now are a viable company. $350 million is a very viable company to be able to continue doing development in this area. That's the incentive. It's purely economic. Yes?
For some of the ultra-orphan diseases that maybe are not captured in the list of the FDA, how much flexibility is it to, piggyback on a category of diseases?
So for the rare pediatric disease program, there is a list that's in the statute. And you either go in that list or you don't. There's also there's other vouchers. There's a tropical disease voucher and there's another rare disease category. So those are lists, and you really have no flexibility because it's in the statute. With the orphan drug designation, what I was mentioning, there is an opportunity for us. I mean, certainly you have to justify that the population you're looking at is intended for a group that's under 200,000 people, and doing that can be a challenge. You're not locked to any list. Whatever disease morphology, identification, the natural history of the disease, however you can describe it, it's going to need to be supported by literature. And I can tell you from having clients who said, oh, we'll take this, there's really 800,000 people, but we'll describe this subset to FDA, and if it's not really a clear defined disease, if it's just a subset and it's not easily identifiable, FDA sees that as you trying to get the orphan designation, but you're going to sell it to all 800,000 people, not just the 200,000. Therefore, you're not an orphan drug. So there is flexibility. A lot of sort of public health and medical economics goes into that part. It's not really a scientific about your drug. It's really public health about the structure of the disease and the size of the disease. Yes?
Does the EMA have a similar incentive?
Yes. And I feel so bad because my colleague, Thomas Roche, who's visiting from France, a firm in France that I work with all the time. So in France, it's of course like the middle of the day, so he's dealing with, I'm sure, a crisis. He and I just spoke this morning on our way in. It's exactly the same type of a structure. It is through the EMA, so it's at the full EU level. It is in regulation. So it's official, it's not by discretion. Their exclusivity is 8 years with an option for 12. So there's actually a longer exclusivity option. All I know about the market exclusivity is that it's the same concept, right? Nobody else can get approvals. There might be some of those other incentives like the tax or the fees that I mentioned. But it is definitely a global view that this is an area that we incentivize. Someone else? Yes.
You mentioned that the FDA is taking a big chunk out of the backlog of orphan drug designation. Have they done that? Have they changed the balance of how many yeses and how many no's they're giving out?
That's a good question. I doubt it. I think the decision making is pretty formulaic. You either meet the conditions of the less than 200,000 and your drug has some preliminary evidence that shows that you have to show that the mechanism of action actually works towards that disease. You can't be looking for a designation that's different. And then you are locked into that. That's the indication that you will be studying in your clinical trials, and it's the indication that will be on your label. So you can't play around with it too much. They're pretty consistent in their decision making.
I can throw in that I was contracting for the FDA a year and a half ago, and they just rebuilt the database and rebuilt the process.
Yeah.
And reviewed it, and I think that was probably part of the reason things got cleaned up.
Yeah, I think it was a process issue and a prioritization. So there are no fees associated with submitting that designation request. So that goes to show you what happens when we don't have user fees. It just, things pile up and you get to it when you get to it. And many of the same people who are involved in reviewing the upfront designation are also the same scientists and regulatory specialists who are involved in product, they're on the teams, the actual review teams for things that might be subject to certain timeframes under the reviews. More questions? Okay, Yes.
Sorry, did you say there's explicitly a list of diseases or just the way one defines it?
explicitly a list of diseases for rare pediatrics and tropical. They can add to those, so to this gentleman's question, how much flexibility is, you can add to the list, so there's a process to send to FDA, and FDA will present it to Congress in their next, quarterly or whatever report, and they can add to the list. But there is a specific list.
It's not in the statute itself?
No, it's maintained by FDA. Yeah.
Okay,
Yep. Other questions? Okay, so let's talk quickly about devices. I'm going to just flip forward to this. There is a lot of focus on rare diseases in the drug space, and when it comes to devices, there also is a program. It's called the Humanitarian Use Device, the HUD, and you can get a humanitarian device exemption. I'll explain that in a moment. But FDA actually was very interested in understanding where the need is when it comes to devices. And just so you understand, the humanitarian use device is a much more constrained population. It used to be 4,000 people or less, which is very hard to define. You need to be talking about, I've worked with clients, those are usually musculoskeletal diseases with some sort of device that's a structural support or an implant or something to help them, and that disease is rarely presented. With the 21st Century Cures from 2016, that 4,000 became 8,000. So it's great, it doubled, but 8,000 is still a very narrow population. This is not a heavily used pathway, and FDA is looking into whether or not there's a need for further incentives in the device area. My first slide, I did mention breakthrough therapy and breakthrough device. These are additional types of designations that have certain incentives with them. And I think the breakthrough device is one worth mentioning. We've had an expedited access program for class 3 PMA devices for quite a long time, maybe 8 years or so. With 21st Century Cures, they changed that, they call it now the breakthrough device pathway, which is a little bit broader, and it is applicable to more than just PMA applications, but also it could be a 510K or a de novo application. So it's a broader type of devices that could be eligible. So you don't necessarily have to be a class 3 risk in order to be considered a breakthrough device. And there are many devices that are combination products, and so if a device is identified as the primary mechanism of action, maybe with some other drug functionality built into it or drug delivery system issues, those would be eligible as long as the primary mechanism of action is the device. So that's that. There are some other things. There are rare disease programs that FDA runs and operates. They have a grant program, they have a natural history grant program, there's actually a pediatric device consortium grant program. 21st Century Cures dumped quite a bit more money into this. I looked it up on my way in this morning. The Orphan grants program is spending about $14 million a year on 100 projects. So the projects are ranging about getting to $200,000 to $300,000 a year in this grant, which is a pretty good sized grant. And I think I'll just tell you that there are a number of, now that's sort of the pathways and the things that exist. The biggest challenge, which I know the next speaker is going to talk about, is the clinical trials. Obviously, if you have a rare disease, you are not in a position to do what the FDA rules require, which is that you have adequate, well-controlled studies. I have, as I mentioned, this academic center, we have about 14 patients identified globally with this condition. We are now in discussions with FDA to figure out, obviously we're not doing placebo with them. Obviously we're not going to be able to get statistically significant. There's a lot of obvious, like we really can't do anything else other than observational study. And is FDA going to be able to accept data, and what kind of data are they willing to accept? We actually can't even really run safety studies because it would, we just have to treat these patients. And so there's a lot of challenge. The good news is there's a whole office within FDA designated to deal with these issues, and there are a couple people who are advocates of what we call like uber rare or super rare diseases that have pioneered some really unique opportunities with FDA. And I did throw up here, if you want to research this a little bit more, there is this particular drug is a rare disease that went through a process with what is called real-world evidence. So they used the McKesson hospital access, electronic medical records, and they were able to do much more of an observational study instead of a placebo-controlled study. And it was the foundation. It passed the advisory review at FDA, and FDA accepted it, and it is a marketed drug. So we have good evidence that FDA will be flexible, but I think if you get through all the benefits and the flash of the vouchers and the designations and the money and all of that, the hardest part is actually doing the research in a way that will support the application ultimately.
I'm feeling a week-long workshop in the future.
Thank you, Beth.